tardes. En primer lugar, quería expresar.
Good afternoon. First of all, I wanted to thank the organizing committee for allowing me to take part in this conference, and I will try to present in the time allotted of 15 minutes the key lines for the discussion taking place in Spain on the proposed.
Namely, fiscal crime prior to money laundering. The link between the fiscal crime and money laundering takes two forms which are interrelated. But we will discuss the latter one. The first one has to do with illicit profiting, if it is possible to commit a fiscal crime based on profits coming from previous laundering. This is a topic on which jurisprudence in Spain has been establishing a series of definitions. We will talk about it later, but we will discuss the reverse phenomenon, that is, whether the fiscal crime can be a crime that precedes money laundering. We will see that the definition of this matter has to do with dogmatic criteria, mainly whether the two crimes may be included in a set of standards or of crimes. At the same time, it has to do also with criminal policy matters, because laundering, money laundering, is possibly the prototype of a crime that has become more and more common and has resulted in new definition of the constitutional principles of the penal law, which, if taken by the letter, may lead to very bad assumptions, and also it has to do with the international pressures to define this crime as an increasingly widespread one. To understand why this debate has taken place in Spain, we must understand the evolution of laws and the analysis on it, particularly jurisprudence of the Supreme Court. At present, and as a result of the reform by the Constitution, the penal definition of Article 301/1, first paragraph, reads as follows. I will read so that you understand this matter. It reads, the one acquiring, possessing, or converting or transmitting goods knowing that they come from crime committed by him or by any third party, or who carries out any other act to hide or cover up its illicit origin, or to assist the person who has participated in such a crime to avoid the law, will be punished with 6 months to 6 years of imprisonment and a fine. With this law, we are introducing a very important issue in the discussion of this problem, namely self-laundering. The person who commits the previous crime may be the same one who commits laundering. Thus, concerning the fiscal crime, it is stated that if the one who commits fiscal crime or fraud, that same person may later commit a money laundering crime. In this sense, prior to the amendment that I mentioned in 2010, it was said that it could not be the case because later acts from the fiscal crime would be defined by the previous crime, in this case, the fiscal crime, by applying a principle which is regulated in the Spanish law. This logic of understanding penal law and solving this issue said that the later use of what you did with the proceeds from lack of fiscal payments under the law was part of the whole commission of the crime, and it was an irrelevant action for the penal law, and it was thought that the opposite logic could presuppose a violation of the principle, but there was a non-jurisdictional agreement by the Supreme Court 2016 that admitted the possibility of defining a series of crimes in some assumptions. The first thing to say here is that international instruments and the introduction of self-laundering in the penal code did away with that way of seeing things. And the full argument tries to impose the opposite idea, that is, that the fiscal crime, like any other, may be a precedent crime to laundering, and that both could be punished as different crimes. However, the evolution of the laws on money laundering in Spain that has been typified so widely has led lawyers to do otherwise. For example, in 2015 there was a sentence that tried to cover all the excesses in this sense and said that Article 301 only typifies a form of conduct that has to do with acts to cover up crime proceeds or assist the perpetrator to elude or avoid the sanction. With this more restrictive reading, we avoid excesses like sanctioning those who committed previous crimes that resulted in the proceeds from such crime. It also says that as part of this idea, we would include also considering laundering as the mere use of the proceeds for ordinary expenses without any intention to cover up or to have an apparently legal status related to a previous crime. That's the essence of the behavior that is sanctioned as a result of laundering. So the Supreme Court has correctly defined self-laundering, as we have seen before while reading the legislation. A legislator or a lawmaker has not wanted to write it in that sense or with that purpose, but rather as to define alternative behaviors. In Spain, there was a reform that affected fiscal crimes in 2012, and the lawyers pointed out in this reform on the crimes against the country's and public budget that they should take into account the situation for those who have regular or legal fiscal situations. The purposes of this law was to do something legislators should not do normally. That is, writing dogmatic laws. The legislators understood that the tax law should be seen as a negative element. And in the words of the legislators, they said that tax regularization was a return to legality, and it was the reverse of the fiscal crime. All this led to the idea that the Spanish legislators had in mind the idea that somebody who commits a fiscal crime and then resorts to the fiscal amnesty that regulated things as proposed by the legislators to include a whole series of amounts of money that had not been declared would not be conditioned to the idea that the one that paid his taxes would be threatened by an accusation of laundering. So the legislators reformulated the dogmatic character of the tax laws that have always been read as a cause for eliminating the charges. A measure that is included in the punishable realm, and they thought it had nothing to do with the types or the lack of jurisprudence. But the important thing was that with it, they would convey the idea that yes, a fiscal crime could be regarded as an antecedent to money laundering. The reasoning made no sense because a debt not only cancels the fiscal crime but also penal responsibilities stemming from such actions. I cannot get into many details on these matters, but I would like to expound the arguments, the main arguments by both positions, as I mentioned at the beginning. Main arguments on the solution of to the norms that are a solution, a good solution to penal principles, include that the non-declared monies could not be regarded as illicit proceeds, at least as to the commission of fiscal fraud, and the non-declared monies could not be regarded as proceeds from a crime because they had already been defined as part of the person's equity, the person who supposedly had committed the fiscal crime, and it was part of the professional activity, not a criminal activity. There has been a lot of debate on that. They have talked about that the equity has an end, and that those who say that in this case you can also say there is a precedent crime, preceding crime, say that in this case you can also say that it is money coming from a criminal activity. Actually, with that you stress the very principle of legality and of penal taxation principles. This continues to be one of the chief arguments used in particular vote on a famous sentence of 2012 known as a sentence on the Ballena Blanca or white whale case, in which the perpetrator, the one who issued the specific vote, attorney Torres del Moral, said that in this case you cannot say that in the case of undeclared earnings or proceeds that it was an unprecedented criminal activity because the money that had not been declared did not come from a previous criminal activity. Another important argument is that of the author and his actions, the perpetrator and his actions. You have to wonder whether in these cases you can talk of a impugn self cover-up, whether the perpetrator is benefiting from the criminal activity from a previous time, and that therefore, by virtue of self or impugn self cover-up, somehow it is within the logic of the definition of the already committed crime without it being punished again after a later crime, that of laundering. The key idea is that all non-sentenced acts and the indivisibility of these notions, you may think that using proceeds from crime, a previous crime, may also be a separate crime. In this case, the crime of money laundering. Still, all international instruments made some mention of prevention and punishment for money laundering and terrorism. Also in Europe say that fiscal crime may be and is a previous crime to the effect of laundering. With that, it is said that there is a link between the two crimes. In fact, in my view, besides nuanced positions that include the definition of self-money laundering, let's talk about the true and a false laundering, in the sense that laundering may be taking place only for proceeds from what has not been declared, and it is then a fiscal crime, or whether others to be introduced in the market or to invest them in the market with legal appearance, as they do when laundering money. And also, in order to try to solve this problem, they should apply the same idea of the Supreme Court as to the illicit proceeds that I mentioned initially. That includes analyzing a series of criteria on the more or less direct character or link between preceding and later crimes, and the sentence through that includes fines in the first case on the whole sum of proceeds. Besides those nuanced positions, the main idea, in my view, is that despite comparative legislation differences and international laws, the dogmatic principles of the theory of crime should be upheld to try to solve these questions that cannot be solved in no way but seeing each case as a unit. And in that case, we should try to define whether we should apply standards or a group of crime definitions. In any case, you should not forget that we might violate the principle of the indivisibility. And in this case, we would be violating the principle of legality and proportionality in penal sanctions. If you punish somebody for laundering, you should think in terms of their proceeds from the previous crime.